Hello and welcome to this lesson on quadratic equations. So to begin, I'll talk briefly about what quadratic equations are. And quadratic equations are very similar to linear equations in which we solve for one variable, typically x. And the main difference between quadratic equations and linear equations is that quadratic equations will always have an ax squared term. And so the equation will always be ax squared plus bx plus c, in which a, b, and c are all constants. And the goal when we get a quadratic equation is obviously to solve for x, our variable. However, unlike linear equations, it's not so simple because obviously in this case we have an x squared term, so simply isolating the x won't work out. And so in this video, I'll cover how to solve quadratic equations using graphing, factoring, and the quadratic formula. So for graphing, what you want to first do is set aside what the x terms equal to y. So basically, instead of doing ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0, we want to do ax squared plus bx plus c equals y. And from there, we simply want to graph the equation. And when we do that, the easiest way will just be to plug in different points for x. And once you get enough points and you can graph the equation, you have to look for where the function crosses the x-axis, or essentially where the function has a y of 0. And this is what's called an x-intercept. It's simply a point on the graph where y equals 0. And the reason we do this is because, as we saw before, we replaced the 0 with a y. So originally it was ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0. So that's why we need to look for where the function equals 0. We simply set the equation equal to y so that we can graph it. And our answers for x will simply be where we have the x-intercepts. So an example is shown on the bottom. So for, let's say, the function is equal to x squared, and if we plug in different numbers for x, and so like let's say -2, if we plug that in, we'll get 4, -1 will get 1, and so on. And when you graph it, you'll see that at x equals 0, y is also equal to 0. And that basically means that our answer will be 0. And you'll see that in this case, we only have one solution, but typically we'll have two solutions. And yeah. Now, one thing to note is that graphing is probably the hardest method out of all of them, simply because it's, it works for simple equations, but for more complicated ones, it may not be as easy to see where the x-intercepts are. And so it's the most time-consuming, and it can be inconsistent at times. Now, factoring is one of the most common ones or ways of solving a quadratic equation. It's also, it can be relatively simple. However, it's not always the easiest one to do. Now, the goal of factoring is basically to change the equation to the form the quantity of x plus d times the quantity of x plus e, where d and e are both constants. Now, the reason why we do this is because if we can factor our equations to look something like that, we'll simply get two equations, x plus d equals 0, and x plus e equals 0. And both of them are two simple linear equations. And the reason why we can do that is because if we're multiplying two quantities together and that's equal to 0, that means one of those quantities have to equal 0. And when we get those two simple linear equations, we can simply solve for x. And the way that we do this is as written out in the bottom. Our goal, as we mentioned before, is to get the form on the left-hand side of the quantity of x plus d times the quantity of x plus e. And as I mentioned before, the way we write out a quadratic equation is x squared plus bx plus c. So essentially, our factored form has to look like our original form, and so that's why we set them equal. Now, in the second step, you'll see that if we expand x plus d times x plus e using the distributive property, we'll get x squared. Then our middle term will be the quantity of d plus e times x. And then our final term will be d times e. And as I said before, that has to equal to x squared plus bx plus c. And so essentially, to get to d and e, we need d and e to add up to b, but multiply to c. And so this is much more simpler to understand if we have an example. So here's one here. So for our example, let's say we have to factor x squared plus 8x plus 15. And as I mentioned before, we have to find d and e such that d plus e equals this middle term, and d times e equals our final term. And so the way we can do this is we know d plus e equals 8 and d times e equals 15. Now, we can try out different numbers. So, for example, if we have d equals 1 and e equals 7, we know 1 plus 7 equals 8. However, 1 times 7 does not equal 15. So let's try maybe 2 for d and 6 for e. And again, you'll see that 2 times 6 is not equal to 15. So maybe we can try 3 and 5. And if we try 3 and 5, we know that 3 and 5 equals 8. Or sorry, 3 plus 5 equals 8. And 3 times 5 equals 15. And so that works. So we know d and e are 3 and 5. And so then we write that out. So if we factor that, we would get x plus 5 times x plus 3. Because when we factor something, it'll just be x plus d quantity times the quantity of x plus e. And in this case, d is 5 and e is 3. And you can always switch those two around. So it'd be the same. You can just switch those two around. It can also be x plus 3 times x plus 5. You'll get the same result. And if this was a quadratic equation, then we'll know the quantity of x plus 5 times the quantity of x plus 3 equals 0. And so that means either x plus 5 equals 0 or x plus 3 equals 0. And so if we solve for x in both of those scenarios, we'll get -5 and -3. And those are our two solutions. The final way of solving quadratic equations is using the quadratic formula. And this can be more complicated, but the good thing is that it'll work for all quadratic equations. It may take longer than factoring, but it's much more consistent. And the way to do this is simply by using this formula. So if we have the formula, or if we have the equation ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0, x will be equal to -b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac and that whole thing all over 2a. And just one thing to note, when we say plus or minus, that basically means you have to do, there'll be two solutions, so one in which we do negative b plus the square root, and then another solution in which we do negative b minus the square root. And so just a quick example, if we took the example from the previous slide for x squared plus 8x plus 15, we know b is 8, a is 1, and c is 15. And so if you look on this bottom right, you'll see that one of our solutions will be x equals negative 8 plus the square root of 64 minus the quantity of 4 times 1 times 15, and all of that over 2. And when we solve that, we'll get negative 3. Then the same thing will be for our second solution, except instead of doing negative 8 plus the square root, we'll do negative 8 minus the square root. And when we do that, we'll get negative 5. So here are some practice questions, and you can solve these using any method you want. And just to reiterate, graphing is the simplest. However, it can be time consuming and it won't always be the most consistent. Factoring is can be the least time consuming. However, again, it's not the most consistent way, and the quadratic formula is more time consuming, but it'll always work. And so it's up to you which method you want to use, but typically it's good to get practice with factoring and the quadratic formula. So pause the screen, and then I'll show you the answers on the next slide. So 3, 2, 1. And here are the answers. So for the first one, you could get the answer negative 3 and negative 2. And the way you do this, again, any method you want, but if you were to factor it, you would get x minus 3 times x minus 2. Then, you'd get x plus 3 times x plus 2. But then if we solve those two linear equations, we'll get x equals negative 3 and x equals negative 2. Then for b, you'll get just negative 2, and the reason is that if you were to factor this, you'd get the quantity of x minus 2, the quantity of x plus 2 times the quantity of x plus 2, and if you were to solve both of those, you'd get x equals negative 2 for both cases. So just one solution, x equals negative 2. For the final one, you should get x equals 12 and 4, and either way you do it, those should be the answers. If you were to factor it, you would get x plus 12 times x plus 4. And that'll be it for this episode. Thank you so much for watching, and check out Project Slam's social media pages and website, and I'll see you next time. Goodbye.